And the next question, I think, wants to see what lead the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government are going to take on a very international question, which is entirely appropriate because this is a worldwide debate that we're having from Edinburgh tonight. And this comes in live on Facebook from Lexi. And Lexi wants to know that because she's very concerned about the impact climate change is having on people in developing countries, she wants to ask you all, will you commit to a fund to help people in these developing countries adapt to and survive the huge impacts which climate change can bring? Shirley-Anne Somerville.
As part of the work of the previous SNP administration, we've actually increased the amount of money that the Scottish Government gives to international aid, and I think that was a very important commitment.
And how much of that is directly attributed to climate change issues?
It's not directly attributed to climate change. It is a general international aid fund. It was something that was looked at during the passage of the Climate Change Act. And it is something, you know, in an ideal world, if the Scottish Government had powers and control over things like international affairs and international aid, we may want to look at. But the general UK aid budget is held by the UK Government. What the Scottish Government has tried to do is look at how we use that fund, ensure that it's targeted correctly, that it goes on projects that are actually developing on the ground, that actually assist local people, whether it's local produce, local employment. So we've tried to look at the money that we're spending, we've increased that throughout the 4 years, and although our manifesto is not published until tomorrow, I'm sure that's a commitment that will continue in that. But it isn't actually directed specifically at climate change. It's a general fund for international aid.
All right, Mike, do the Liberal Democrats share Lexi's concern about the impact that climate change has on people in developing countries? And if so, what would you do about her suggestion of a fund?
Well, I mean, absolutely. There is a Scottish fund, there is the international development that goes on from the UK government. There are so many issues in developing countries that we need to be dealing with, not least of which are the huge health problems that are in a lot of those countries, which are killing children day in, day out. So it is difficult, I think, to draw a distinction as to where you are going to place that money. I think that
but in principle, do you share her concern, or obvious concern?
Absolutely. I mean, it's clear that the imbalance that there is in the world at the moment is that the countries that are generating the CO2 emissions are not the ones who are feeling the effects most strongly, and we need to be working to reverse that and to make sure that we allow developing countries to develop, but at the same time to develop the technology that will allow them to do it in a sustainable way, in the way in which we have not managed to do.
Sarah Boyack, then what influence could Scottish Labour have on trying to ensure that those in developing countries get a fair deal from climate change and are assisted where appropriate to survive the impacts of it?
Well, at the Copenhagen negotiations, it was then the Labour government was very strongly arguing for an international climate adaptation fund, because the technologies are there, it's just they're not affordable to particularly sub-Saharan African countries and countries in the Far East. So the real issue is getting the UK aid budget spent more intelligently so that there is more climate adaptation money going through traditional aid. And Mike makes the point about health facilities, but you know, I've been to Malawi with the Scottish Parliament, and one of the biggest health problems is people are cooking in small huts and they're using wood to burn to cook their food. Now, there's this at the very basic level that creates horrendous health problems, and it means that people are chopping down trees in Malawi. So there is an issue about the work we've done in Malawi over the last decade. But I think the bigger picture is making sure the UK budget is spent more effectively, and I think that is something that we need to focus on in the next Scottish Parliament, and I think it's something we should all be lobbying for, to make sure that money does stay in place at the UK level and it's spent more wisely.
Patrick Harvey for the Greens, what do you say about the impact of climate change on developing countries from a parliament here in Scotland, which may, as Shirley-Anne said, doesn't have full powers to influence things?
Well, I think there is a very strong case for an additional pot of money for climate change adaptation in developing countries. It should be seen as additional to international aid, to international development funding. which is important in its own right, hugely important, but this is about recognising the moral responsibility that a high carbon country, an historically high carbon country, has for creating climate change, which is impacting most urgently on people around the world. But we need to do more than just have an international aid fund as an adaptation fund as a kind of sop to our conscience. We need to be stopping doing the harm as well. A lot of the countries that are struggling to adapt to climate change have had their own agriculture systems co-opted and captured by multinationals again, coincidentally, to produce luxury goods 12 months of the year for countries like ours. Our lack of seasonality in the way that we expect to eat in Scotland and the UK is one of the things that's harming the ability of many developing countries to have an agricultural system that meets their own inhabitants' needs for the food that's traditionally available. That's something that we need to reverse. An ethical and fair approach to trade would mean thinking about seasonality at home, so that we're not co-opting the agricultural systems of much poorer countries.
Would the Conservatives, Ian, advocate a special pot, a special fund to help people in developing countries survive what climate change throws at them?
Yeah, now this sounds like a question from Lexi from Skiaf. I like that you do good work. The Conservatives, in our last manifesto, going into the Westminster election, in the stage austerity, protected two budgets, NHS and international development, where we actually met our international obligations, and then we've just been through a process recently of assessing what our international aid is doing and using it and focusing it in a much more effective way. But it shows our priorities very much where, in the time when we knew we were going to have to make efficiencies, one of the areas that we said no, we're not going to make any cuts at all at in the international aid budget. I commend the Liberal Democrats for, that was an easy one for us to decide that we agreed on as a priority. I've seen, I worked overseas as an international aid, flood relief in Africa. I lived 6 months with tribe Indians up the Amazon. I see the effect that climate change has on the people who are the most vulnerable and who are not producing the carbon like we are. One of the interesting things that another way away from the international development budget that excites me is the billions of pounds that we're putting into the Green Bank to develop new technologies which will affect the whole world. If we're creating some world-leading new technologies that are improving our environment, improving our getting towards a low carbon, carbon-free future, it is. So the Green Investment Bank as well, that will see big differences across the whole world.
Okay, we have another question coming in live from Calvin and also from many others, and this is about what the parties feel about imported biomass being used for large-scale power generation, bearing in mind the drive this creates for deforestation, and here in Scotland, again very near where this debate is being broadcast from, we have a local issue which I think the Scottish National Party referred to in your earlier remarks, Shirley, and this was a biomass plant in the port of Edinburgh, Leith, and the questioner asks yea or nay to this. Patrick Harvey.
Well, I couldn't agree more with the tone of the question. The idea that biomass can be a low carbon fuel if you're having to burn fuel to move it around the world before you actually generate energy with it is simply nonsensical. Biomass does have a role to play if it can be produced locally. Many rural communities could be producing locally from land that's not really prime agricultural land, that's not necessarily taking away from feeding people. Could be producing locally biomass that's got a huge contribution to make for their own local energy needs. That's the kind of approach that I'd like to see more of in many communities. But the idea of shipping biomass fuels around the world before they're used is every bit as absurd as the coal-fired power station proposal at Hunterston, which would be dependent on imported coal. Just doesn't make sense.
The Scottish National Party against deforestation?
Well, in particular the aspect of the biomass, well, yes, it makes no sense, and the policies that we have at the moment are all about small-scale, off-grid biomass that will actually assist a local community, particularly rural communities. That's completely diametrically opposed to what we've got down in Leith, which is a far too big development in entirely the wrong place. The fact that the actual timber being imported from the other side of the world to a plant which won't even have any heat generated from it, simply electricity, just adds to the folly of the entire aspect. Now, this is something that is still going through the due planning process. The decision will be taken by Scottish ministers in the future, but certainly as an Edinburgh MSP,
A former Edinburgh MSP.
Yes, as an Edinburgh MSP at the time where this came out, it's something I've campaigned against. To be fair with other political parties as well, who were in the Parliament at the time, and it's something that is exceptionally strong on the doorsteps that people want to know that cross-party we're going to actually vote against this, and I hope that whatever Scottish Minister is in place, that we actually do that.